Sekarang ini emang merosot semua, menurun semua.
John Condon is an agricultural journalist and has written about the beef market for decades. The billion-dollar live export industry in Australia depends heavily on Indonesia, with the foreign nation relying on Australian cattle to supply over one-third of their beef market.
It's an enormously attractive market for Australia, even though it's still a developing economy, and its ability to pay obviously is a lot less than a developed country like Japan, for example. But we see Indonesia as one of our absolutely priority markets for cattle or beef from Australia in coming years, particularly as the economy continues to grow.
In Indonesia, demand for beef has been increasing steadily as the wealthy middle class grows in size. Unfortunately for Indonesians, the purchase price of cattle from Australia is historically high because of 2 years of drought bringing supply to a 30-year low. Additionally, costs at all points of the supply chain have increased, resulting in a much higher price for beef.
And as a result, basic supply and demand. Supply is short, so price goes up. And the Indonesians currently are having to pay considerably higher prices for Australian cattle than they have previously.
The majority of beef in Indonesia is bought and sold at local wet markets, with the substantially increased prices turning many lower-class consumers off purchasing the meat. As a result, the local operators, or pedagang, have seen their profit margins substantially reduced.
Kalau giliran rame ya bisa 100. Tapi kalau giliran sepi hanya 115. 18, 16, 10, 4 tahun. Iya, konsumen kan berkurang pasti ya kalau harga daging naik kan. Pembeli juga jarang. Belum. Baru kuliah yang besar.
Diki Adewoso owns feedlots in Indonesia that import Australian cattle. He says that the pricing problem is compounded by confusing and contradictory policy.
The policy is over-engineered by the government. The government are looking at try to solve a problem that was created in the past. They try to create to solve the problem short term. So they created an artificial supply and demand. One is for them to support the local farmers, increase the numbers of cattle for breeding and so on. In the meantime, they also are forced to reduce the price for another populist policy for the consumers. So, like today, right now, they ask us to sell the beef at 80,000 rupiah. In the meantime, our cost of goods sold has already gone up above that 80,000, close to about 110,000, and that's where it is very contradictory policies. Both sides.
The Indonesian Ministries of Trade and Agriculture are attempting to reduce the price of beef in the short term by introducing more cheap boxed meat alternatives, along with also increasing the weight limits from cattle from Australia. In the long term, they're seeking to increase the overall size of the domestic herd through breeding programs, along with implementing a quota of breeder cattle alongside slaughter cattle for meat in Indonesia. Richard Slaney, the director of a breeding program in Indonesia, says that due to the lack of data being gathered by the government, its target is aspirational.
Unfortunately, I think the Ministry of Agriculture still is quite draconian in the way it works. It doesn't have a very, it really doesn't accept much outside input as to how it might work better. Publicly, they're not willing to say those things. Privately, they probably know very well that they lack the data that's required to make decent policy.
Red meat protein is not going to be much more cheaper in the future. There is a global pricing benchmarking. So I don't think that it's very ambitious for the government to have it at 80,000. I don't think that it's achievable.
The pedagang at the market also don't have much faith in the government's ability to look after their best interests.
enggak, kan dia didata. Di golongan yang ke bawah ya, yang didata. Kalau yang menengah atas nggak didata. Dari golongan bawah. Ya.
There's a growing consensus that the Indonesian government will fail to achieve its target to substantially lower prices, particularly if issues further up the supply chain aren't addressed. While the ministry continues to play football with policy, locals at the market grow doubtful about their future. Timothy Swanston, UQ in Indonesia.